It is late. The light in your room is too white or too dim, and your phone keeps vibrating like a small alarm you refuse to name. Someone asks for a favor, not with cruelty, not even with urgency, just with that familiar tone that implies you already agreed. Your thumb hovers over the keyboard. You type "sure" before you check your calendar, before you check your body, before you check your own life. Then you stare at the sent message and feel the quiet drop in your stomach. Jung would call this your persona speaking faster than yourself. Epictetus would say you just took responsibility for something that was never yours to carry. This video is about why you betray yourself to keep other people comfortable. And if you listen closely, you will hear the betrayal every time you say yes while something inside you goes silent. Part 1. How you learn to disappear. People-pleasing is rarely about being nice. It is about staying safe. The fawn response is what happens when your nervous system decides that harmony is the fastest exit from danger. Fight feels too risky. Flight feels impossible. Freeze feels humiliating. So you become agreeable. You become useful. You become easy to manage. You learn to scan faces the way other people scan traffic. You learn to detect irritation before it becomes punishment. You learn to anticipate needs so you do not create problems. Attachment patterns form around this. If love was unpredictable, if approval was conditional, if affection was followed by withdrawal, the child learns a brutal lesson. Belonging is something you earn. Belonging is something you maintain. Belonging is something you can lose in one wrong sentence. Jung's idea of the persona becomes lethal here. The persona is not evil. It is a social instrument. It is the part of you that knows how to function in the world. It knows how to be polite. It knows how to be competent. It knows how to be chosen. The problem begins when that instrument becomes your identity. When your sense of self is built on being accepted, the persona stops being a mask you wear and becomes the face you live inside. The real self gets pushed into the shadow. The shadow is not just dark impulses. It is everything you were forced to suppress to stay lovable. Your anger, your refusal, your taste, your appetite for space, your desire to disappoint someone and survive it. You can see it in everyday scenes. At a family dinner, a comment lands on you like a small insult dressed as a joke. You laugh because everyone else laughs. In a meeting, a coworker takes credit for something you did. You stay quiet because you do not want friction. In your relationship, you say it's fine because you have learned that asking for what you want creates tension. You develop a signature move. You soften your own needs to keep the room stable. You become the emotional shock absorber. It looks like maturity from the outside. It feels like shrinkage from the inside. This is why boundaries do not feel neutral to you. A boundary feels like a weapon. A boundary feels like abandonment. Your body treats a simple no as if it will trigger punishment. So you try to be strategic. You try to be charming. You try to be useful enough that nobody ever asks you to prove your worth. The tragedy is that the more you perform safety, the less safe you become inside yourself. Because you cannot trust a life that you keep editing. You cannot respect a self that you keep bargaining away. The most confusing part is that you are not lying in the obvious way. You are not trying to deceive people for advantage. You are deceiving yourself for belonging. You convince yourself you wanted to do it. You convince yourself you are just generous. You convince yourself you are the calm one. But the body remembers. The body keeps a list of every moment you swallowed your truth. This is where the fatigue starts. Not the tiredness of doing too much, but the exhaustion of never being fully present as yourself. Part 2. The Mechanics of Resentment. Epictetus draws a line that most people refuse to see because it demands responsibility. Some things are under your control. Your judgments, your choices, your values. Other things are not. Other people's reactions, moods, opinions, and gratitude are not yours to govern. People pleasers live as if that line does not exist. You treat other people's emotions as your assignment. You treat their comfort as your duty. You take responsibility for their disappointment as if it were a crime scene you caused. At the same time, you neglect what is under your control. Your time, your energy, your attention, your self-respect. You become a caretaker of the external world and a deserter of your internal one. This is why you feel trapped even when nobody is forcing you. The cage is built out of invisible contracts you never signed, but keep honoring. If someone is upset, you rush to fix it. If someone is distant, you assume you did something wrong. If someone is disappointed, you try to repair the story. You do not call this fear. You call it being considerate. Epictetus would call it confusion of roles. You have stepped into positions that are not yours. You are acting as the manager of other people's inner weather. Then you wonder why your own inner climate feels neglected and hostile. Jung would say that the shadow grows in proportion to what the persona suppresses. Every time you swallow a boundary, something goes underground. That underground place becomes crowded. It becomes charged. It begins to press upward. This is when you start behaving in ways you do not recognize. You snap at the wrong person. You ignore texts for days, not because you are busy, but because you need air and you do not know how to ask for it. You show passive aggression because direct assertion feels unsafe. You talk about being overwhelmed, but what you mean is that you feel owned. Nietzsche is useful here because he does not let you hide behind morality. He would look at your chronic niceness and ask what it is really protecting. In his view, resentment forms when the will cannot move freely. When you cannot express refusal, your energy turns sideways. It becomes bitterness. It becomes moral superiority. It becomes silent contempt. You begin to tell yourself that you are the good one because you endure. You begin to believe you are noble because you sacrifice. You begin to build an identity around being needed because being needed is the only form of security you trust. Then the resentment starts to leak into your relationships. You agree to help a friend move. You show up and smile. Inside, you are counting every past favor that was not returned. You offer emotional support to a partner. You stay patient. Inside, you are keeping a ledger of how often you were ignored. You say yes to extra work. You act reliable. Inside, you are fantasizing about quitting and disappearing. The resentment is not random. It is the shadow asking for a voice. It is the self demanding the space that the persona keeps selling. At this point, your people-pleasing becomes a trap for everyone around you as well. Because you train people to meet a version of you that does not exist. They do not learn your limits because you never show them. They do not learn your real preferences because you keep hiding them. They do not learn where you end because you keep offering yourself as a resource. Then, when you finally crack, they act surprised. They say you changed. They say you are being dramatic. They say you are cold now. But what they really mean is that you stopped being easy to use. The worst consequence is internal. You begin to lose faith in yourself. You cannot tell whether your affection is real or just anxiety. You cannot tell whether your kindness is genuine or just a fear response dressed as virtue. You become suspicious of your own warmth. And once you distrust yourself, you become even more dependent on external approval. It is a loop. The persona performs, the shadow grows. The resentment sharpens. The self-trust collapses. The persona performs harder. Part 3. Who you become when you never say no. There is a quiet horror in living a life that is constantly negotiated. It does not feel like tragedy at first. It feels like adaptation. But over years, the adaptation reshapes your identity. You stop asking what you want because you are too busy predicting what will keep you accepted. You stop exploring your real opinions because disagreement feels like danger. You become skilled at reading others and clumsy at reading yourself. This is not humility. This is disconnection. Jung would describe this as a person possessed by the persona. The persona becomes the king of the inner citadel. It makes decisions based on image. It chooses actions based on how they will be perceived. It edits your speech to maintain a role. The role might be the good child, the reliable friend, the calm partner, the helpful coworker. Roles can look honorable. Epictetus respected roles, but he insisted that roles must be chosen and performed with awareness. The problem is not having a role. The problem is being owned by one. Nietzsche would add another layer. He would argue that when you are always accommodating, you are not only betraying yourself, you are also refusing the responsibility of self-creation. You are letting the crowd write your script. You are letting comfort and approval determine your character. He would see the people-pleaser as someone who has not yet claimed the right to offend. Not because offense is the goal, but because a self that cannot risk conflict cannot be real. A self that never risks being disliked is still a child standing at the door of belonging, waiting for a stamp of permission. This becomes obvious in the small humiliations that pile up. You rehearse messages for 15 minutes to make sure they sound warm enough. You add extra words to soften a simple request. You explain your reasons until you feel embarrassed. Then you explain more. You feel guilty for resting. You feel guilty for having needs. You feel guilty for having limits. You feel guilty for becoming tired of being the one who holds everything together. And then you feel guilty for your guilt. The inner life becomes a courtroom. The persona is the lawyer. The shadow is the witness. Nobody is free. The social world rewards this pattern, which makes it harder to break. People praise you for being understanding. They call you mature. They say you are easy to be around. They say you never make things complicated. That praise is not evil. But it is dangerous because it buys your silence. Every compliment becomes a small bribe. Every thank you becomes a chain. The longer you live like this, the more terrifying it feels to change, because you think you will lose your place. You will lose your identity. You will lose the only kind of love you have known, the love that arrives when you are useful. This is where the concept of the inner citadel matters. Marcus Aurelius would talk about an inner fortress that cannot be taken by other people's opinions. But you do not build that fortress by repeating affirmations. You build it by practicing one thing you have avoided your whole life. The clean number, the simple boundary, the refusal that does not beg for permission. Epictetus would say you regain freedom when you stop trying to control what others think and start controlling what you do. Jung would say you regain wholeness when you stop identifying with the mask and make room for the shadow. Nietzsche would say you regain dignity when you stop living as a function and start living as an author. The world does not collapse when you stop being the soft place everyone lands on. It only feels like collapse because your nervous system has been trained to interpret disapproval as danger. That training can be undone, not with slogans, with exposure, with repeated proof, with choices that restore self-trust 1 inch at a time. Protocol: practice the clean no. Begin with the moment you usually lose. It is rarely the big confrontation. It is the small request that arrives at the wrong time. It is the extra favor. It is the last-minute plan. It is the text that says, "Can I ask you something?" and already tightens your chest. In that moment, do not rush to be good. Pause long enough to feel your body. If your stomach drops, if your throat tightens, if you feel the urge to over-explain, treat that as data. Jung would call it a signal from the parts you keep in the shadow. They are not trying to ruin your relationships. They are trying to stop you from abandoning yourself. Then practice the short response, not the clever one, not the one that turns the no into a motivational speech, the short one that respects both people. "I can't. Not this week. I'm not available." Say it and stop talking. Epictetus would remind you that your job is not to manage their reaction. Your job is to choose in line with what is under your control. You will feel a spike of anxiety. Let it happen. This is your nervous system realizing it cannot use the old strategy. Stay with the discomfort without fixing it. This is how you teach your body that disapproval is not death. Next, watch your repair reflex. People pleasers do not just say yes. They repair in advance. They apologize for existing. They add extra warmth to compensate for boundaries. They offer alternatives they do not mean. They rush to prove they are still good. Refuse that reflex. Let the boundary stand as a fact. Nietzsche would say this is where you stop making morality out of fear. You stop performing goodness as a way to avoid conflict. You allow yourself to be neutral. You allow yourself to be disliked by someone who only liked your usefulness. Finally, rewrite one sentence in your private language. The old sentence is simple and poisonous. "I am safe when everyone approves of me." Replace it with a sentence that does not lie. "I am safe when I respect myself." You will not believe it at first. That is fine. The point is not belief. The point is repetition while you act. Every clean no is a brick in the inner citadel. Every boundary you keep is proof that you exist. Over time, you will notice something strange. The resentment quiets down, not because you became nicer, but because you stopped disappearing. Outro: your worth is not a group project. You do not need to become cruel to stop being compliant. You need to become accurate. Jung would say the goal is not to destroy the persona, but to stop being possessed by it. Epictetus would say your freedom begins when you stop trying to control the uncontrollable and return to what is yours. Nietzsche would say your life cannot be built on the approval of the herd without costing you your soul. People-pleasing looks like peace, but it is a war against your own boundaries. The moment you start telling the truth in small doses, the war starts to end. Your life is not a voting process, and your self-respect does not need a quorum.